Before I introduce Peter Burman, Guild Companion and Guild Director responsible for international relations, can I, on behalf of the whole Guild, thank him for being the instigator and champion for these events? And can I thank both Peter and Clive for the work they've done to make this new series?
Feeling queasy, but I think the doctor's got to the bottom of what's wrong with me.
So, without more ado, over to you, Peter.
Hello. On behalf of the board of the Guild of St. George, I welcome everyone to the first event of our project to celebrate and support the people of Venice. As you know, there are going to be 4 monthly readings from Ruskin's writings on Venice, not only from the Stones of Venice, and then a one-day conference by Zoom at the very beginning of April. And the conference program is still coming together.
Peter, you're suddenly muted. Can you just unmute yourself?
Am I back again now?
Yes, you're back again now. So sorry, yeah, I don't know why.
Yeah, so sorry. The speakers, the keynote speakers will include Jane Demosco and Professor Francesco Banderini. The big topics they introduce will be supported by a number of 10-minute contributions, so that altogether there will indeed be many voices from Venice, which is the overall title of the event, all 5 happenings, weaving, we hope, a tapestry of concern, love and support for Venice and its people at this difficult time in history. In this first reading this evening, the voices will be British voices, those of Clive Wilmer and myself. But the Guild is nothing if not international. We have members, or companions, as Ruskin called us, in 13 countries nowadays, and other readers come from as far afield as India and North America via Ireland, Sicily, and of course, Venice itself. We all have in common a deep love for Venice, for the city of Venice and its distinctive cultures of language, art, architecture, music, food, and water. We all equally share in common a deep concern for the present plight of Venice. The overriding problems are the rising of the tides in the lagoon, the overall exploitation and mismanagement of the lagoon, the stealthy draining away of the population, the real population of Venice, the empty properties of those who are exploiting the real estate of Venice, and the monoculture of over-tourism, which has many negative aspects. It is my pleasure now to introduce our first reader, Clive Wilmer, poet and literary critic of the University of Cambridge, where he is an emeritus fellow in English at Sydney Sussex College. He was Master of the Guild of St. George from 2009 for 10 momentous years of growth, progress, and the special events and projects which surrounded our celebrations of Ruskin's 200th birthday in 2019. Not everybody knows that Clive and I were fellow students at the same college, King's College, Cambridge, where we overlapped by a couple of years. We were both present, I know, at an amazing reading in 1964 by the poet Tom Gunn, who made a deep impression on us both, probably for different reasons. Clive began a friendship with him then, which lasted many years, and which has culminated this year in the publication of a substantial volume of Tom Gunn's letters, with Clive as one of the editors. I have read about a third of them so far, and I'm enjoying them very much. We did not see one another then for many years, until about 25 years ago, when I drove the roughly 100 miles from the University of York, where I was then teaching, to Ruskin's Brantwood to hear Clive read his own poetry. His poetry and his friendship have nourished me ever since. Clive's publications are numerous, and they include 2 edited books published by Penguin, which have introduced countless thousands of readers to key texts of John Ruskin and William Morris, respectively. Ruskin's Unto This Last and Other Writings, 1985, and Morris's News from Nowhere and Other Writings, 1993. Both have magisterial introductions by Clive, which have been very influential. Meanwhile, and this is another very important thing about him, he has spent a serious proportion of his life teaching in Italy. Lucky man. In Florence, Verona, Padua, and Venice. In 2015, he was visiting professor at the Ca' Foscari University of Venice. It's not surprising, therefore, that we have as a guild so many companions and friends in Venice. Clive.
Peter, thank you so much for that generous introduction. And thanks also to Simon for what he had to say at the beginning too. Simon, can we have the image of Bunny's picture, please?
Yes, indeed.
Most of you will recognize the picture on your screens. It represents the western facade of one of the world's most beautiful buildings, the Basilica of St. Mark in Venice, filling the eastern end of St. Mark's Square. It is an oil painting, notable for the accuracy and precision with which the building and its materials are rendered. It was commissioned by John Ruskin as the centerpiece of the museum he created for the working people of industrial Sheffield. And it still dominates the Ruskin collection, now held in Sheffield's Millennium Gallery. It was painted over a long period of time, 1877 to 82, by John Walton Bunny, who lived in Venice and was deeply trusted by Ruskin. It was not commissioned as a work of art in its own right, though I think it deserves to be valued as such, but as the record of a beautiful artifact that most visitors to the museum in Ruskin's day would never have had the privilege of seeing in reality. But the picture had another purpose too. If you look closely at the southwestern corner, the one on the right near the entrance to the Ducal Palace, you'll notice that unlike any other part of the basilica, which is noted for its polychromatic splendor, the stonework is uniformly bluish gray. This is because at the time when Ruskin commissioned the painting, the Venetian authorities had embarked on a program of restoration. I hope my voice suggests the heavy quotation marks I put around that word. For there was a fashion in the 19th century for reconstructing ancient buildings to make them look as they ought to have done. In this case, conforming as far as possible to neoclassical principles, symmetrical, mathematically exact, and in color, demurely monochromatic. Ruskin commissioned Bunny's painting in despair, hoping to have an accurate record of a building that he thought was about to be destroyed. In the event, as Peter will be telling you shortly, Ruskin's opposition to the rebuilding was, with some crucial Venetian support, largely successful. But it is still the case that Venice is sometimes her own worst enemy. Today, the issues are tourism, or as Peter says, over-tourism, and flooding, the latter caused by the fact that the wooden piles on which Venice is built are steadily sinking deeper into the mud, which is a natural phenomenon, but exacerbated by climate change and the consequences of political corruption. The tourist problem is a classic example of the goose that laid the golden egg. Tourism is a big earner, Venice's biggest. But for much of the year, the sheer number of visitors makes life intolerable for anyone living in the city. So the resident population has fallen into steep decline. I must also mention the scandal of the cruise ships. Vessels 2/3 of the height of St. Mark's bell tower that enter the city and decant their thousands of passengers onto the piazzetta. Well, this is a problem of tourism as well, but it's also the case that these monstrous invaders do untold damage to the ancient foundations of the buildings, as well as to the lagoon ecology. Venezia è laguna, say the banners of the protesters. Venice is the lagoon. But we should not get too sniffy about this. Ruskin spent something like 1/3 of his life traveling abroad. And books such as The Stones of Venice, and even more so St. Mark's Rest, are addressed above all to tourists. But he quickly realized that in drawing attention to the beauties of the city, many of them previously unknown to British and other visitors, he was indirectly the cause of incalculable destruction, and he suffered from the guilt of it. Nonetheless, what we now call cultural travel remains central to Ruskin's work and to what he had to teach his readers and students. Over the next 10 minutes, I shall read you one of the 2 or 3 most famous things he ever wrote, his verbal account of St. Mark's facade, addressed to the English traveller 30 years before Bunny finished his painting, at a time when he was already so much concerned about the city's survival as to think of his intensely lyrical tribute as, like the painting, the record of an endangered artifact. Not for the first time in the Stones of Venice, he takes us on a sort of journey. It is only a brief walk. It's only a brief walk, in fact, but at the heart of it is a moment of visionary transformation. We begin in some narrow back streets, long since swept away, and witness the ordinary complexities of life in an impoverished city, steeped in the traditions and imagery of a still vividly living Christianity. We pass the Baroque facade of San Moise, which Ruskin detested, by the way, find ourselves in an area destroyed and rebuilt by Napoleon, and then enter what the Italians call the Bocca di Piazza, the mouth of the square, where the lofty bell tower lunges into view, and quite suddenly, the tone and rhythm change as we glimpse for the first time, as if in a vision, an image of paradise come back to earth, a vulnerable paradise. We find ourselves in a paved alley, some 7 feet wide where it is widest, full of people and resonant with cries of itinerant salesmen. Overhead, an inextricable confusion of rugged shutters and iron balconies and chimney flues pushed out on brackets to save room, and arched windows with projecting sills of Istrian stone, and gleams of green leaves here and there where a fig tree branch escapes over a lower wall from some inner cortile, leading the eye up to the narrow stream of blue sky high over all. On each side, a row of shops, as densely set as may be, occupying in fact intervals between the square stone shafts, about 8 feet high, which carry the first floors, intervals of which one is narrow and serves as a door, the other is, in the most respectable shops, wainscoted to the height of the counter and glazed above, but in those of the poorer tradesmen left open to the ground, and the wares laid on benches and tables in the open air. The light, in all cases, entering at the front only, and fading away in a few feet from the threshold into a gloom which the eye from without cannot penetrate, but which is generally broken by a ray or two from a feeble lamp at the back of the shop, suspended before a print of the Virgin. The less pious shopkeeper sometimes leaves his lamp unlighted and is contented with a penny print. The more religious one has his print coloured and set in a little shrine, with perhaps a faded flower or two on each side, and his lamp burning brilliantly. Here at the fruiterer's, where the dark green watermelons are heaped upon the counter like cannonballs, the Madonna has a tabernacle of fresh laurel leaves. But the pewterer next door has let his lamp out, and there's nothing to be seen in his shop but the dull gleam of the copper pans hanging from his roof in the darkness. Next comes a vendita fritole liquori, where the Virgin, enthroned in a very humble manner beside a tallow candle on a back shelf, presides over certain ambrosial morsels of a nature too ambiguous to be defined or enumerated. But a few steps farther on at the local wine shop, the Madonna is in great glory, enthroned above 10 or a dozen large red casks of 3-year-old vintage, and flanked by goodly ranks of bottles of Baraschino and 2 crimson lamps. And for the evening, when the gondoliers will come to drink out under her auspices the money they have gained during the day, she will have a whole chandelier. A yard or two farther, we pass the hostelry of the Black Eagle, and glancing as we pass through the square door of marble deeply moulded in the outer wall, we see the shadows of its pergola of vines resting on an ancient well with a pointed shield carved on its side, and so presently emerge on the bridge and Campo San Moise, whence to the entrance into St. Mark's Place, called the Bocca di Piazza, mouth of the square. The Venetian character is nearly destroyed, first by the frightful facade of San Moise, and then by the modernizing of the shops as they near the piazza, and the mingling with the lower Venetian populace of lounging groups of English and Austrians. We will push fast through them into the shadow of the pillars at the end of the Bocca di Piazza, and then we forget them all. For between those pillars there opens a great light, and in the midst of it, as we advance slowly, a vast tower of St. Mark seems to lift itself visibly forth from the level field of checkered stones, and on each side the countless arches prolong themselves into ranged symmetry, as if the rugged and irregular houses that press together above us in the dark alley had been struck back into sudden obedience and lovely order, and all their rude casements and broken walls have been transformed into arches charged with goodly sculpture and fluted shafts of delicate stone. And well may they fall back. For beyond those troops of ordered arches, there rises a vision out of the earth, and all the great square seems to have opened from it in a kind of awe, that we may see it far away, a multitude of pillars and white domes clustered into a long, low pyramid of coloured light. A treasure heap, it seems, partly of gold and partly of opal and mother of pearl, hollowed beneath into 5 great vaulted porches, sealed with fair mosaic and beset with sculpture of alabaster, clear as amber and delicate as ivory. Sculpture fantastic and involved, of palm leaves and lilies, and grapes and pomegranates, and birds clinging and fluttering among the branches, all twined together into an endless network of buds and plumes. And in the midst of it, the solemn forms of angels, sceptred and robed to the feet, and leaning to each other across the gates, their figures indistinct among the gleaming of the golden crown through the leaves beside them, interrupted and dim, like the morning light as it faded back among the branches of Eden, when first its gates were angel guarded long ago. And round the walls of the porches there are set pillars of variegated stones, jasper and porphyry, and deep green serpentine spotted with flakes of snow, and marbles that half refuse and half yield to the sunshine, Cleopatra-like, their bluest veins to kiss. The shadow, as it steals back from them, revealing line after line of azure undulation, as a receding tide leaves the wave sand, their capitals rich with interwoven tracery, rooted knots of herbage and drifting leaves of acanthus and vines, and mystical signs, all beginning and ending in the cross. And above them, in the broad archivolts, a continuous chain of language and of life, angels and the signs of heaven and the labors of men, each in its appointed season upon the earth. And above these, another range of glittering pinnacles mixed with white arches edged with scarlet flowers, a confusion of delight, amidst which the breasts of the Greek horses are seen blazing in their breadth of golden strength, and the St. Mark's lion, lifted on a blue field covered with stars, until at last, as if in ecstasy, the crests of the arches break into a marble foam and toss themselves far into the blue sky in flashes and wreaths of sculptured spray, as if the breakers on the Lido shore had been frostbound before they fell, and the sea nymphs had inlaid them with coral and amethyst.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Clive.
Thank you, Peter. Forgive me, I think I've lost my place in all that. That glorious passage first appeared in 1853. We now move forward about 24 years to the Ruskin who had recently founded the Guild of St. George and was acting as we in the Guild should act now. For this, I hand you over to Peter Burman with thanks for his friendly introduction to me. Peter is a director of the Guild. He has responsibility for international relationships and for craft and craftsmanship. His first role after graduating from Cambridge was with the Council for the Care of Churches and Cathedrals, where he rose to be General Secretary. During that time, he and Marcus Binney, another Cambridge friend, organized a major exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, Change and Decay, the Future of Our Churches. For another 12 years, he was director of the Centre for Conservation Studies at the University of York. And while in York, he founded the York Art Workers Association and the now international Building Limes Forum. Then he was called to Edinburgh. I only ever moved northwards, he said at the time, to be Director of Conservation at the National Trust for Scotland. And then finally, Professor of Cultural Heritage Management at the University of Cottbus near Berlin, which has an internationally famous Centre for World Heritage Studies. He was for 20 years chair of the Fabric Committee of St. Paul's Cathedral, and for 10 years arts advisor to Lincoln Cathedral. His published work is in the main about different aspects of conservation philosophy and good practice, and about his architectural hero, Philip Webb, close friend of William Morris, Peter is also the author of a book on St. Paul's Cathedral. He's now going to introduce you to the fascinating figure of Alvise Zorzi, whom Peter, with his deep knowledge and experience of architectural conservation and craftsmanship, is especially well qualified to talk about. Peter.
Thank you, Clive, very much indeed. I have a very human story to tell, and so I've called my introduction Ruskin's Hug, which may be surprising, but anyway, here we go. Count Alvise Zorzi was a Venetian nobleman, as his name suggests, of ancient lineage. He was an artist, a historian, and later a museum director. And I believe he deserves our recognition for the contributions he made to conservation theory. First through his 1877 pamphlet, Osservazioni intorno ai ristauri interno ed esterno della Basilica di San Marco, which turned the tide in favor of conservation rather than restoration, with Ruskin's support. Later in the same year, he published a pamphlet protesting against the demolition of the church of San Moisè. In defending San Moisè, successfully again, with its richly sculptural facade of 1668, Zorzi demonstrated a healthy independence from Ruskin's thinking, with an appreciation of Baroque architecture that was ahead of its time. There is no doubt that the Basilica had serious structural problems by the time Giovanni Battista Meduna was appointed clerk of the works in 1857. However, his interventions went way beyond what was necessary to stabilize the fabric. His first major undertaking was the radical rebuilding of the north side. He took down the whole of the marble facing, laid new foundations, and rebuilt the internal masses of the wall. Regrettably, he had the columns scraped with pumice stone, and a facing of unpicturesque, smooth-veined Tino marble was substituted for the precious ancient one, in the words of Camillo Boito, in his great account of the restorations of St. Mark's, published in the late 1880s. Emboldened by an initially favorable response, Meduna turned to the south side, where we are now in this wonderful image, including the portico at the southwest corner. The magical appearance pre-restoration can be inferred from this study of Ruskin's. A part of St. Mark's, sketch after rain, he called it, now at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Ruskin later called it the most beautiful example of Byzantine colour I could give. The result of Meduna's work was that the horizontal lines of the south side were altered, thus no longer making a true junction with the west front where they turned the corner, and the old marbles, in Ruskin's words, inestimable for their historical value, rarity and colour, were again dispersed or destroyed. It was public knowledge in 1876 that Meduna now intended similar treatment to the whole west front, picking up from where he had left off, as you vividly saw in that wonderful painting by Bunny. Ruskin's and Zorzi's interventions were therefore timely, of vital importance, and ultimately happily successful. In that winter of 1776-77, during which Ruskin was in Venice, Zorzi was in his early 30s. He had learned English largely so that he could read Ruskin. He was strongly influenced by Ruskin's principles as expressed in The Lamp of Memory of 1849, in concluding that the works carried out to the Basilica di San Marco from 1866 onwards had been essentially destructive. His friend and contemporary, Raffaele Carlo Forti, a young artist of some ability, had become a protege of Ruskin, who actually paid for him to attend the Accademia in Venice, and Carlo Forti had promised Zorzi an introduction to the great man, to Ruskin. Zorzi told the story himself in a 1906 article published in the Cornhill magazine. He describes how, after an initial failure to meet up, Ruskin had invited him to come to his hotel on the evening of the 7th of December, 1876. Zorzi took with him the manuscript of his pamphlet, and Ruskin asked him to read it. All at once, as Zorzi recalled, Ruskin interrupted me by springing to his feet. I did the same and found myself in his arms. For 30 years, he said, with emotion kissing my forehead, I had been seeking a Venetian patrician, an artist who would think and write about Venice and about St. Mark's, as you have done, my young friend, and I am happy to have found you. Ruskin immediately offered to pay for the publication of Zorzi's text and to write a preface for it, saying, I am yours, I am yours, I am at last a Venetian. And that letter to Count Zorzi, translated into Italian, is in fact the promised preface to the pamphlet. We can trace the ideas of Ruskin and Zorzi about building conservation through the writings of such practitioners and theorists as Camillo Boito, whom I've already mentioned, who was a celebrated professor of architecture at the Brera Academy in Milan, and a reconciling theorist between seemingly intractably opposite modes of conservation, a wise and good man, and Giacomo Boni, who was a close friend of Philip Webb and a keen supporter of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings' approach to the repair of old buildings, and later many others, up to and including the Venice Charter of 1964 and the World Heritage Convention of 1972. Today's best practice derives from Ruskin and those followers, while incorporating elements not adopted or available in Ruskin's lifetime. In the 1950s, for example, the Church of England decided that there should be quinquennial inspections of the condition of all churches and cathedrals. A splendid basic idea, and yet one that hadn't been adopted before. And cathedrals such as Wells, which you see in front of you on the screen, and Lincoln, both cathedrals which Ruskin greatly admired, have not just their cathedral architects today, but archaeologists, art historians, stonemasons, conservators, curators, the clergy, and well-informed and highly motivated fabric committees. A breakthrough was the Wells Cathedral West Front Committee, 1974 to 86, of which I was one of the 3 art historian members, which brought every skill together on an equal basis. Similar provisions now obtain in other European countries. If Ruskin could visit a cathedral workshop today, he would no doubt be astonished to find that the craftspeople and conservators invariably include women as well as men, all highly trained and motivated. In November this year, at a gathering at Exeter Cathedral, exactly a month tomorrow, I found a real sense of partnership between the cathedral architect, the clerk of works, the craftspeople, here is one, and conservators, and was assured that everyone has the opportunity to contribute their skills and knowledge to decisions about the maintenance and repair of the building. There is also nowadays sophisticated digital recording of everything that is being done, so that in future years there will be no doubt about the date at which new stones were introduced. I'm now seizing a volume in my much treasured set in our home of the great edition of Ruskin's works from the beginning of the 20th century, a really beautiful set of volumes. And I'll be reading altogether 5 of the paragraphs of the letter to Count Zorzi, and I hope you'll agree when I finish doing so, that it is a piece of Ruskinian literature that deserves to be very much better known. And it would be wonderful if the Guild of St. George could consider at least publishing an English language version of it. I believe it never has been translated into English yet. Perhaps I'm wrong. Anyway, here are Ruskin's own words. During 30 years of constant labor in our English schools of art, I have been striving to convince our students of the eternal difference between the sculpture of men who worked in the joy of their art for the honor of their religion and the mechanical labor of those who work at the best in imitation and too often only for gain. In my own country, now given up wholly to the love of money, I do not wonder when I prevail little. But here in Venice, your hearts are not yet hardened. Above all, not the heart of the workman. The Venetian has still all the genius, the conscience, the ingenuity of his race, and a master who loved his men and sought to develop their intelligence and to rouse their imagination might be certain of rivaling by their aid the best art of former ages. And the chief purpose with which 20 years ago I undertook my task of the history of Venetian architecture was to show the dependence of its beauty on the happiness and fancy of the workman, and to show also that no architect could claim the title to authority of magister unless he himself wrought at the head of his men, captain of manual skill, as the best knight is captain of armies. But the modern system of superintendence from a higher social position renders good work impossible, for with double fatality, it places at the head of operations men unacquainted with the handling of the chisel and sure to think the mechanical regularity meritorious, and makes it the interest of the superintendent to employ rather numbers of men educated in a common routine, so as to be directed with little trouble, yet whose collective labor will involve larger profit, than the few whose skill could be trusted, but whose genius would demand sympathy and claim thoughtful guidance, regarding not the quantity of their work, but its excellence. While therefore it is impossible to speak with too much sorrow of the destruction brought upon St. Mark's, it must always be kept in mind that this is not the fault of the Venetian workmen, but of the modern system by which throughout Europe, the money profit resulting from the extensive employment of mechanical labor becomes a motive for persons who have no real art faculty to occupy themselves in the direction of imitative work, for which, of course, no genius in design is required. Thus, the nations are made to pay for the ruin of their ancient monuments instead of the raising of new ones. And in France and England, during the last 20 years, the destruction wrought by this cause alone has 100-fold exceeded all the ruin of former time, neglect, and revolution. But this catastrophe in Venice surpasses all in its miserableness. St. Mark's was the most rich in associations, the most marvelous in beauty, the most perfect in preservation of all the 11th century buildings in Europe. And of St. Mark's, precisely the most lovely portions were those which have now been destroyed. Their mosaics especially were of such exquisite intricacy of deep golden glow between the courses of small pillars, that those two upper arches had an effect as of peacock's feathers in the sun, when their green and purple glitters through and through with light. But now they have the look of a peacock's feather that has been dipped in white paint. I cannot guess where the sandy or muddy brown stone has been brought from, the commonest kinds of Verona marble being brighter, nor can I understand how the Venetian people can bear to look at such colour, while the pictures of Carpaccio and Gentile Bellini in front of us now show the beautiful warm red, which, as you, dear Count, so rightly observe, was everywhere used on house fronts in those days of perfect art, giving the name of Venetian red to that colour all over Europe. What changes have been made in the other stones, or what damage done to the surfaces of those which remain, I do not know. But this I know, that in old time I looked every day at this south side of St. Mark's. Here we are again with that wonderful sketch of Ruskin's, wondering whether I ever should be able to paint anything so lovely. And that now, not only would any good colorist refuse to paint it as a principal subject, but he would feel that he could not introduce that portion of the building into any picture without spoiling it. It would not indeed have been possible, unless with Aladdin's lamp, to make new St. Mark's as beautiful as the old. For the like of the old marbles cannot, I believe, be obtained from any now known quarry. So that last year, lecturing in my schools at Oxford on the geology of architecture, I took these very marbles as principal illustration, and to my bitter sorrow, was able to hold in my hand and show to my scholars pieces of the white and purple veined alabasters, more than a foot square, brought here in Venice out of the wrecks of restoration. But now I must be mute for shame, knowing as I do that English influence and example are at the root of many of these mischiefs, unless indeed I venture partly to answer the question which will occur to the readers whom you, dear Count, convince. What means of preservation ought to be used for a building which it is impossible to restore? The single principle is that after any operation whatsoever necessary for the safety of the building, every external stone should be set back in its actual place. If any are added to strengthen the walls, the new stones, instead of being made to resemble the old ones, should be left blank of sculpture, and every one have the date of its insertion engraved upon it. The future antiquary would then still be able to study the history of architecture on the authentic building. In my own work, it now takes me at least half the time I have to study a building to find out first what pieces of it are genuine. The use of sculptured and gilded wood for permanent interior support would often rather enhance than diminish the picturesque effect of the building. Iron bands may be used externally for the support of walls whose decay does not admit of repair without danger. Many ruined abbeys in England, here is one, Rievaulx Abbey in Yorkshire, many ruined abbeys in England, which are fortunately situated in the private grounds of noblemen, have been thus retained in beauty and strength for any period, and the retention in their position of the highest arches of the amphitheatre at Verona is an admirable instance of similar care in Italy. In other words, no reconstruction. And now, I leave the cause in your hands, dear Count. If, by your intercession, the facade to the square and mosaics of the porch can yet be saved, every true artist in Europe will bring you tribute of honor and future Venice of never-ending gratitude. Whatever be the issue, your protest cannot be in vain, and I do not doubt but that all your future life will be stronger in the sense of having now accomplished your duty in sincerity so fearless and so earnest. Once more, farewell. I have written in haste and have not said anything that I would in praise of your essay, because it may perhaps seem to you desirable as to me it would be gracious to publish this stranger's testimony for such support as it may bring to your own. But I must at least, in closing, be permitted to express the deep respect in which I accept the name you have given me of friend. Respect for your faithful love for art, your no less faithful love for truth, and your most faithful love for your country, in whose days of trouble and rebuke you bear your ancient name in its unblemished honour. Indeed so I remain, your affectionate friend, John Ruskin.
Thank you, Peter, for that splendid passage, so splendidly read. We now have a little opportunity to talk to one another before Simon throws this open to the floor. And I wonder if I could ask you a question, Peter. It seems to me that that letter of Ruskin's, I was going to say essay because it is in a sense an essay too, is terribly underrated. And I would say that it has a quality I'd call prophetic in the way that it looks to the future about the role of the workman, the role of the architect, and the character as it should be of restoration, the character as it should and should not be of restoration. And these are matters of which I know you have a deep experience, and I wonder if you could comment on that.
Thank you very much indeed. So long as I can ask you a question afterwards.
It's quite fine, as they say.
Thank you very much. Well, yes, I agree. Prophetic in the sense that Ruskin is reaching out to articulate the actual how-to of repairing ancient and historic buildings on the kind of ethical basis which he and Morris after him came to articulate, because it was, as they saw it, the only way to respect the past and to bring the past into the present. And in front of him, he had all too vividly the doomed approach of St. Mark's, which we've just heard in those very angry words of Ruskin. So I in my mind's eye, I'm seeing the young Count Zorzi as especially focused on the lamp of memory 30 years ago, as Ruskin says in his letter, where Ruskin's great cry, "Take proper care of your monuments, and you will not need to restore them," continues to echo down the decades, now the centuries. And that's why I mentioned the quinquennial inspection of the condition of ancient buildings being such an important step in the 1950s, where, as I understand it, the wartime neglect meant that there was really quite a crisis among the major buildings, as we know, right across Europe, not just in England or Britain. So I think we can say that with the anointing of Count Zorzi as almost his successor in a certain kind of way in Venice, and in the same year of 1877, his anointing of William Morris and Philip Webb, I've actually held in my hands a letter from Ruskin to Morris saying, "Of course you may quote from the Lamp of Memory, and I support everything you're doing in setting up this body to be called the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings." So prophecy followed by a certain degree of fulfillment. And I think we also need to bear in mind that what Ruskin says in the letter is his direct response to Zorzi's text. He clearly wants to respond to that passion in the young man's pamphlet. So he adds a little more, the idea that stones should be put back and dated. He couldn't know that by now we would have computerized recording of everything that's done on a great building under repair when it can be afforded, but on the best buildings it is afforded. And even more so that we'd be working in multidisciplinary teams with the art historian and archaeologist contributing as much as the stonemason architect and conservator. I'll end with a little anecdote of mine. When I joined the West Front Committee at Wells Cathedral, I went up on the scaffolding on my own with the then cathedral architect, a very distinguished man whose father had been a great arts and crafts architect. I won't mention his name just now, and I came to be very fond of him indeed, but I was very shocked when he addressed the master mason as Wheeler, as though he was talking to the butler or a manservant. I thought, gosh, what a funny old world this is. But as the 12 years of the West Front project went on, we always stayed overnight in Wells for the meetings, and we were made so welcome by the cathedral community that we all got to know each other. And by the end, long before the end of the program, long before the middle of it, I should think, the cathedral architect was calling Wheeler Bert, and Bert was calling him Alban, which he never would have dared do before. So in a sense, through that remarkable program of work in Wells, we broke down the social barriers and we had the social revolution that Ruskin was arguing for in that letter. And I was so moved when, and I must confess, I've tipped Simon off about this. A year ago, I went to Wells Cathedral, having not been there for a long time. And in the cloisters, I was amazed to see a beautiful but simple tablet, beautifully lettered. And it was a memorial, not to the architect, but to the master mason. Look at it. In grateful remembrance of William Albert Wheeler, Bert. And then the dates. Master mason, 1935 to 1978. He devoted his life to the cathedral. First in the choir, he was a chorister, and then for many years in the mason's yard. A true craftsman. What a tribute.
What a tribute.
Wasn't it?
Fantastic.
So now I want to ask you a question, dear Clive. I was following your reading with bated breath because I love that moment of, to use words from Ruskin, great light, which leads us through Ruskin's prose after all that interesting detail about images of Our Lady and lamps burning or not burning and the gondoliers having very jolly time and so forth. Suddenly we have that great vision out of the earth, St. Mark's, a vision of paradise, surely, as we know, paradise is one of Ruskin's great themes, leading the eye to a continuous chain of language and of life, a continuous chain of language and of life. And what I've been longing to ask you in your capacity as a literary historian and critic, what impact those great sentences of Ruskin's, rather long as they often are, studied with beautiful ideas and rich materials referred to constantly, what effect do you think they had on subsequent writers of the 19th and 20th centuries, perhaps even up until today?
Well, it's a very interesting and good question, and it's one that has never really been properly answered, I think, partly because I think we don't know enough about what people were taught in the 19th century, particularly in America, actually, where I think Ruskin was probably compulsory reading in most schools. And so the writers of the modern movement, people like Pound and Eliot and James Joyce and Yeats and so on, all read Ruskin under compulsion, really. And it wasn't necessarily that they liked him enormously, but that they inevitably picked up things from him. And I think the background to this is that, of course, Ruskin himself spent about 20 years of his life trying to be a poet. He started when he was 7, and he carried on until he was about 28, when he gave up, I think finally realizing that he wasn't a very good poet. But what he did in poetry, or what he aspired to do in poetry, spilt over, I think, into his prose. And in the process, he became a kind of prefiguration, or he produced a kind of prefiguration of certain aspects of modernist poetry, or that sort of modernist prose that is ready to spill over into poetry. The obvious example, actually, is Marcel Proust, who regarded Ruskin as the greatest influence on his work. And of course, in Proust's case, it's interesting because he was also learning to do something in French, which it was much easier to do in English. That's to write in these long, apparently endless sentences that unfold bit by bit, which are a perfect way of capturing the threads of memory linking together in the mind by association, which is what Proust is concerned with. But I think you can find signs of Ruskin in many of the major figures of modern English writing, certainly in Pound, overtly and confessedly in Marianne Moore, here and there in Auden. And I think there are echoes of him in some poems, particularly early poems of Eliot's, and in the prose of Joyce, and in Virginia Woolf as well. So it's an interesting story, and it really needs to be documented properly and discussed fully. So I think it's a great question of yours, not one that I can give a very conclusive answer to, though.
Well, that sounded like the beginning of a very rich answer indeed. Thank you very much. I'm glad I thought to ask it. More and on, I hope, more and on.
So at that point, can I say, first of all, most importantly, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Clive, for what were beautiful readings. And I can only apologise to you all for the gruesome technical mishap, which delayed the satisfaction of Clive, your reading. And to say that we do have, for those of you who are still with us, which is a fair number, we now have space. If anybody would like to unmute to share a reflection that's been generated in your own mind by one of the readings or by anything that you've heard Peter and Clive talking about. Now, there are obviously I can only see those of you who have your picture on, so I can only see hands if I can see you. But if anybody would like to add something, do please feel free. Just raise your hand, unmute, and step in and share anything you like, if you would like to. Don't be bashful. I'll just keep an eye on the images I can see. Anybody like to say anything? Well, you're so overwhelmed by the great flood of Ruskinian poetic prose. Ross.
Yes. Oh, just to say that I thought that was absolutely marvellous. I've been attempting. I'm a companion of the Guild of St George myself, and if I do try and keep up to date with, I try and read bits of Ruskin from time to time. But certainly the pieces that we heard this evening were absolutely key, I suppose, to Ruskin's relationship with the great city of Venice, and so well read as well. I think it really, I think it was been a wonderful experience altogether listening to you both.
Thank you. Anybody else like to add anything?
Oh, Simon.
Jeffrey, hello.
Yes. Sorry, my camera's not working for some reason, but
Okay.
yeah, I was going to ask a question about what Ruskin would feel about the restoration of a major building, for example, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, and what should be done to restore a major building which is, in that case, severely damaged by fire. What do you think his view would be on how that building should be restored? Of course, it's very controversial anyway, but what would Ruskin be saying were he alive today?
So there's a challenge, Peter and Clive, to channel the great man. Which, Peter, do you want to go first? Yeah.
I'll just say a couple of things. One is that the external appearance of Notre Dame in Paris owed more to Eugène Viollet-le-Duc than to the Middle Ages. And personally, I'm a great fan of Viollet-le-Duc in a certain sense. You know, he was a tremendous scholar, like William Burgess in England and Wales, Burgess with one S rather than two, a profound knowledge of the Middle Ages. And he was living at a moment when there was a terrific amount of money about and a great sense of national pride, especially in France. He and Ruskin actually had a bit of a conversation together by letter. They were both Alpinists, for one thing. But I think, like the Patriarch of Venice, when the Tower of St. Mark's fell down, I personally think that Notre Dame should be restored to be as it was, where it was, when the fire happened. And I think there are always possibilities for creativity in the interior of a great church, or for that matter, a great castle or country house, if basically the fabric is recreated. But I'll just say that it happened that I was in York, how long ago was it? A quarter of a century ago, on the very hot July night when the Minster had its terrible fire. And because I was friendly with everybody there, I went with a friend. I was at the General Synod of the Church of England at the university. I went to the Minster with this friend who was a director of the ecclesiastical insurance company. So they were naturally very worried about the fire. And we walked into the North Choir aisle and we saw the unbelievable. We saw the sky. And then I was talking to the sculptor who had lent a great Pietà to the Minster for a period of years, carved out of wood, very large, very moving, very beautiful. And it had been charred by the fall of the burning timbers. And we were standing there and he turned to me and said, "It's better, isn't it?" Which I thought showed a great deal of modesty, that he thought the fire had improved his work. But when the south transept of York Minster was repaired, there was a sense in which it could only be restored to how it was, but there was the opportunity for some creativity. And the bosses of the wooden vault were designed by school children, and they're actually very inventive and very jolly. We were there in June for the reopening of the York Minster organ after restoration, and we looked up at that ceiling, that vault, with those lovely carved bosses, and we thought, yes, there is a contribution of the 1980s or whenever it was. I can't remember exactly. It took, of course, a long time to do. Every case clearly has to be judged on its merits, as we all know. But I would say that for iconic buildings, think of St. Paul's, for example. You wouldn't want to do the West Front in a modern style, would you, if it got a terrible fire or a bomb attack, which is always possible in our conflicted age? We would try, surely, for the same reasons as the Patriarch of Venice uttered those memorable words, to rebuild it as it was, where it was.
Clive, do you want to add anything in response?
Yes, I do, actually. Just a couple of things. The last thing that Peter said actually reminds me of the chapter in the Stones of Venice on the Ducal Palace. But of course, the Ducal Palace had a terrible fire in the late 16th century. And a committee was set up to decide what should be done about the building. On one side of the committee was Andrea Palladio, who thought it should be demolished and a new building built, which presumably would have been designed by him. And the other side was Sansovino, who thought it should be rebuilt as it had been. Now, Ruskin in The Stones of Venice stands on the side of Sansovino because he loves the Ducal Palace, but actually in doing so, he's contradicting his own views expressed elsewhere, which are that once a building has been destroyed, it should be left as it is. And I think I'm reminded of the image of Revo Abbey that Peter also showed us, where Ruskin would have said, well, you know, the damage has been done. Now do to the building something which will prevent it from falling down and keep it as it is, but don't add anything to it. So I think that's probably what he would have said about Notre Dame, actually, is my guess. But he could have said what he said about the Ducal Palace. I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you. Would anybody else got a question for Clive or Peter, or would like to share a reflection? Or maybe we're winding down towards our end. We've gone well beyond the hour. I think I'm not seeing anybody else burning to speak up, contradict, challenge, or reflect. So in that case, I'm going to bring things to a close. And once more to say an enormous thank you on behalf of all of us this evening to Peter Burman and to Clive Wilmer for the evening, for conceiving of this reading and this pairing of texts, and for, as I think was so self-evident, the immense amount of time and care and scholarship and heart that has gone into preparing their introductions and their reflections.